Hi, welcome to this video blog. Why do we study history of philosophy and not philosophy itself? Is philosophy detachable from its history? What's the role of history of philosophy in understanding philosophy? If you also want to find answers to such questions, then you are in the right place. I am Hanif Amin Beydukhti, and this is my video blog on the historiography of philosophy in the Islamic world, brought to you by the support of Fritz Thyssen Stiftung and LMU Munich. Let's find answers to these questions with the help of my venerable guests. My guest is Professor Dr. Nadia Germann. Nadia Germann is full professor of philosophy at Albert Ludwigs Universität Freiburg, where her special focus is on Arabic philosophy, falsafa, or philosophy in the Middle East. Next to several articles such as How to Teach Things with Words, Al-Farabi, Mayin's Doubt, and The Transmission of Knowledge, she has also published a monograph and 3 edited volumes. Most recently, she has edited Philosophy and Language in the Islamic World together with Mustafa Najafi. Her research includes topics related to medieval Latin philosophy, histories of philosophy, philosophy of language, logic, epistemology, and metaphysics. Check the link in the description of this interview if you are interested to see a full list of Nadia Germann's publications. Hello, Nadia. Thank you very much for accepting my invitation.
Hi, Hanif. Thanks a lot for inviting me and having me here.
It's a pleasure. A contemporary scholar describes somewhere the current tradition of falsafa in Iran as being more interested in the reconstruction of living philosophical debates than anything else, including the history and the tools of historical research, and as not interested in historical context. On the other hand, Mehdi Haeri Yazdi, in the introduction to his very first philosophical work, The Universal Science, criticizing the modern philosophy scholars, writes that the only research or effort which is the result of their course of higher education is into the history of philosophy and how it came into existence and evolved in the hands of certain people. And there can be no doubt that this method of thinking at least exists among the majority of them. It is the result of ideas which they have heard from the mouth of professors and copied verbatim. It is abundantly clear that it is in no way possible to plumb the depths of questions concerning philosophy via such a superficial manner of teaching and learning. For each of these questions is a matter for intellectual analysis and examination. Historical discussion, he writes, no matter how exciting and beneficial they are, bear no relation to the essential discussion on the philosophy itself, and these two systems must be distinguished from each other completely. In the same vein, he complains that European writings on falsafa are more concerned with the lives of philosophers and the description of their writings rather than with the content of their philosophical debates. So he recognizes the works of Orientalists before him as works of adab and literature, rather than works on philosophy and wise theoretical exploration. With this prelude, I would like to start our interview with some general but also crucial questions. Nadia, what is in your understanding the meaning of the term falsafa, philosophy in the Islamic world, philosophy in the Middle East, Arabic philosophy, or however you would like to translate it? And how do you define and delimit it?
Thank you very much. I mean, this is certainly a difficult question, and as always, a question for denomination is well, I think I should perhaps distinguish 2 main aspects, particularly when I try to describe how I use the term falsafa, which is perhaps a little bit specific and obviously closely related to my own research. So I would not just call it a synonym of the term philosophy as I use it, and the term philosophy as I use it is is a broader term, which more or less seeks to refer to what I understand by philosophical thought in general. The term Falsafa, by contrast, I do not just use as a synonym of the other expressions that you just suggested, like philosophy in Islamic world, in the Middle East, or something like this. I take it in a more narrow sense, which is due to the fact that my research chiefly focuses on the early periods of Arabic, Middle Eastern, whatever you want to call it, philosophy. And I think in this period particularly, it's a term which denotes a very specific approach to philosophy. So it's much narrower than philosophy in general. It's Hellenized or Aristotelianized or Aristotelian Neoplatonic philosophy, and done by people, by scholars like Farabi or Ibn Sina, who explicitly describe themselves as followers of this tradition. But I wouldn't say that philosophy in the Islamic world, in the Middle East, is limited to only this kind of trend, of tradition. And so when I use it personally, and also in my publications, I use it to refer to this specific trend or school or group. But obviously, I think probably the way you use it in this interview is a little bit broader and trying to cover what might be called Arabic, Islamic, Middle Eastern philosophy. So we should just agree on how we use it in this interview. And
yes, of course. So if I have understood you correctly, you use the term falsafa in this way for a historical phenomenon, right? A historical period of thought, or a historical genre of writing.
A historical approach of philosophy. So as a school of thinkers who, by their contemporaries but also by themselves, were clearly affiliated themselves or were affiliated with Greek philosophy. So in a way, the successors of Aristotle, to some extent also Plato. So what has been translated, or what was translated, and this line of thought, this track of thought.
So when you do study history of philosophy or history of falsafa, what are you doing? Why are you, I mean, more explicitly, why do you study history of philosophy and not philosophy itself? For what purpose? And why history of it?
Yeah. Well, this is also a long story. I mean, on the one hand, what drives my research are philosophical issues. So specific philosophical topics I'm particularly interested in. So we can perhaps talk about it in more detail later, but to boil a long story short, I'm interested in thinking, the human being as the thinking animal, and what it means, what kind of expressions thought finds in the human being. And so this is what brought me at some stage, already when I started with my PhD, into the history. In a way, for me, the history is the quarry, the empirical material you can sift in order to find out about issues related to thinking. So the approaches, the reasons why specific approaches are taken, the purposes for which they are taken. So what is the expected outcome of specific methods of reasoning? So all these questions, these epistemological or anthropological questions related to thought, and they can be studied best at empirical examples, so to speak. So for me, it's the era where you can find empirical material for the kind of questions I'm interested in. And so this is why I decided, on the one hand, to look into historical material, but on the other also why I decided not only to look into European stuff, but also into other cultures, broadly conceived.
What do we learn from history of philosophy about philosophy itself? Do you think that our historical inquiry must add something to the current stage of inquiries on a certain topic, like language or words, or no? only shedding light on a certain period of time on a certain figure is enough for calling our research a philosophical or a historical research on philosophy.
Yeah, well, I think it does contribute to our philosophical activities, even though in some ways I do distinguish between both. So on the one hand, I think, well, the one thing is the hardcore historical aspect of doing historical research, where you have to deal with texts that are there, and where you have to, I think, apply hermeneutical methods that are in a way that give account of how you proceed, so that follow specific scientific standards. So this would be, so to speak, these aspects would be the historical hardcore work. But the reason why I look into it is to get ideas about, in my case, to get ideas about it, not just ideas, but to get insight into how people at different times, under really different circumstances, thought about specific issues that, or at least some of which, are extremely closely related to issues, problems that bother us nowadays. So for instance, I mean, you know that there is a lot of research in contemporary Western philosophy about language. I mean, it's something we in the West usually credit ourselves as the inventors of philosophy of language. Yeah, perhaps the label is invented by us, I don't know. But still, I think this kind of interest in what is language and what does it mean, and what does it mean for us as human beings to be endowed with language, and what does it change? Just think of the rather recent book by Charles Taylor, The Language Animal, 2016 or something. So obviously it's something which still bothers scholars nowadays, philosophers nowadays, in various manners. But here you have approaches, the kinds I'm studying, of the 10th or already 9th, 10th century of the Common Era, which are at least as rich as the ones that you find nowadays. And so, of course, you could say, well, but that's just archival work. So what does it tell us? But it tells us alternative ways of looking into the same or closely related problems. And also it shows us that some tracks were further pursued, whereas others weren't. And of course, this raises the question of why. Why did this kind of approach succeed and not the other one? And what does it tell us about, for instance, the convincingness or not of our thought nowadays, and whether it's perhaps a good idea to try out a different approach, a different view on the same issue, and so on and so forth. So I think it takes part, or it can take part, and this is exactly what I try to do, at least once I get into discussion with students or colleagues or whatever. But you can bring it into serious dialogue, into a serious conversation with the issues, concerns, and questions that we have nowadays. And it's as sophisticated, these discussions are as sophisticated as the ones that we have nowadays. And so I think this really contributes to a philosophical kind of view at a certain set of questions, problems, whatever your focus is. And in my case, it's obviously language and thinking. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. That was a very good and detailed answer. So now I have a more practical question. I want to ask you about your own strategy of research. How do you engage in your own philosophical research? I mean, what is your own strategy for doing research on topics which belong, obviously, to a remote past time? So topics that are bound to be historical. So, and of course, I mean, I would like you to explain your strategy in a pedagogical way so that the students also can learn from it.
Yeah, well, that's a tough question. I mean, boiling down an entire study program into one answer. But yeah, I think so first of all, as perhaps already previous answers at least indicate, I'm very much interested in concepts. I think in a way, and the approach I'm pursuing is some sort of history of concepts, perhaps you could call it that way. And so what I usually do is working as much as possible with primary literature, so original texts written on issues that deal with the kinds of concepts, problems, questions I'm interested in. And so it's a textual hermeneutical exercise at the first place. But of course, this being said, if you want to enter a new field, you have, I think, of course, to search around a little bit for secondary literature, which may or may not be already there concerning either the period, or the authors, or the topics. And of course, there is a lot of fields to cover still. So you'll often come to the point very quickly where there's not so much secondary literature out there that you could integrate. And so this would be another thing, as I read the texts, that I at the same time try to get an idea of what's already there in terms of scholarship. And then I think one other issue, but that's probably also owing to my own philosophical view of how thinking works. I also try to get an idea of the intellectual universe of the author, of the texts that I'm studying, of the time period I'm moving around, because I'm very much convinced that philosophy doesn't take place just in the blue or in a laboratory. So without connection to other things going on, and so I very much try to take into account other intellectual areas. In my case, when I focus on language and thought, that would be probably fields like kalam, or fields like nahu, or fields like adab. That's a very important field, at least in this very early period I'm looking into. So there is a range of fields, intellectual fields, and I think once you get an idea of how this universe functions, works, then you can much better situate specific treatises or discussions, because usually they do reply to certain questions, issues of their time. And so all of a sudden you notice, oh, there's really an issue that's important, that's crossing the boundaries of the disciplines, and that's discussed perhaps not in identical terminology, that changes perhaps across disciplines, but that really shows you that this is something which drove scholars at that period of time. And so this is how I try to identify important issues, and this is how I actually stumbled upon language as really one of the core topics, or core issues. Perhaps it's more like an issue that is like a thread crossing at least various centuries. I mean, I can't tell yet for later centuries. I haven't come beyond the 12th century so far, but still, that shows you that there is something which is really important in various fields, and that helps you understand specific individual texts. So I don't know whether that was pedagogical enough, but
yeah, thank you. That was pretty pedagogical. A question actually has occurred to me now. So if I may to kind of reformulate or summarize your answer, I can say, or if I want to identify steps in your strategy, then the first step would be reading the primary literature, then the secondary literature, then contextualizing the text within its historical context, right? So the first two steps are actually shared between the contemporary, between research on contemporary stuff and also research on other fields of philosophy. Like if someone wants to do research on a contemporary text on philosophy of language, he would or she would read first primary literature and then secondary literature, and then thematize a question and would try to find an answer to it. So would you say that the thing or that it is only the third step that makes your work historical, or shifts it to the domain of history of philosophy, or there is also something else that may distinguish your work from research on history of philosophy, research on philosophy itself? Or you would say research on history of philosophy is same as research on philosophy. There is no difference between them.
Well, in the way you cast it now, I would say there's no real distinction between that. But because I think, in a way, my research itself, of course, I'm dealing with historical texts, and I'm always aware that there is this time gap, this cultural gap, this, there are all sorts of gaps due to this long period that's in between. But other than that, I'm reading these texts for the same purpose as I would read and follow a contemporary discussion. So I mean, and I often do that. I mean, in my teaching, for instance, I often teach contemporary philosophical debates about issues such as language or what have you. And so in a way, the approach I'm pursuing there and using actually as material for teaching in the classroom is not really different from the one that I pursue in my research, except that, of course, in my research, I have to take into account the distantness of the terminology, the concepts, the historical situation, basically everything related to the datedness of the text itself. I mean, I think it's every student has made that experience. The further you go away with text that you read from your own kind of situation you're in, be it temporally or be it culturally, the more hermeneutical effort you have to make to really translate concepts. And by translating, I do not just refer to the vocables, so to speak, but really to this kind of grasp of what is the meaning of specific terms, expressions, and in which kind of setting do they reverberate and develop their specific signification. So this is perhaps what makes it historical research, but the approach itself is, in this way, it's totally interested in the philosophical concepts themselves, and like, the contemporary kind of approach.
Thank you very much. So now I would like to change the topic of our interview a bit and push it towards the issue of the history of historiography of falsafa. So as you better know, one of the grave misgivings and drawbacks of European historical scholarship on falsafa was the myth of the death of falsafa or philosophy in the Islamic world after Averroes. Of course, due to the critique or criticism by Ghazali. And this myth was fabricated by Ernst Renan around the end of 19th century. But it was also repeated in several books on falsafa for some decades. But after a while, European scholars started to criticize the Renanian approach, and after a while, they managed to abolish, kind of, in a way, the Renanian myth. So one of the first figures of this movement of criticism was actually Sayyid Jamaluddin Sadabadi. He was a Muslim, or al-Afghani. So some people say he was Iranian, some others say he was from Afghanistan, but no matter where did he come from, he was one of the pioneers of this movement. But when Persian-speaking community started to read European scholarship on the falsafa, they confronted themselves with this myth, which was contrary to their own experience, to their own Leibniz or lived experience. And so they were kind of disappointed, and many of them even stopped reading European scholarship on falsafa or on history of philosophy, because they said these guys have a like misguided view of the fate of philosophy or the fate of falsafa. Could you, I mean, this question is again a bit pedagogical or maybe pedantic, but could you please explain to our addresses what is the current dominating grand narrative of European scholarship of the development of falsafa, and how historical research played a role in abolishing the Renanian narrative of the death of philosophy in the Islamic world?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is, I think, a very important question, and you're pointing at the sore spot. I mean, it's about the own historiography, but then also, so to speak, the reciprocal perception thereof and the prejudices we tend to have when we look at the other approaches or tradition and so on and so forth. So I think we should perhaps distinguish two elements of European scholarship here, or two layers of European scholarship. There is the general layer of, let's call it just history of philosophy in general, which is often written by people who don't know much about anything outside Europe. So they usually wouldn't even mention falsafa. And now I'm using falsafa in the way you do. Or if they do, then perhaps they would repeat these old kind of prejudices, so that after the 12th century, there was no philosophy left in the Islamic world. However, the serious kind of philosophical research that exists in the meantime, and particularly those people who do work themselves on falsafa, when they write histories of falsafa, or perhaps also broader focus, but including falsafa, then of course nowadays it's clear for everyone, also in European scholarship, that the tradition continued, and that there is an extremely rich kind of flourishing culture that evolved after the 12th century and beyond, and not just one culture, but you have different, of course, also there different trends and schools, and of course that's something which in the meantime is generally acknowledged, and there are very interesting developments, I think, in historiography, at least among the experts. There are very interesting developments going on. Probably you know them pretty well. Just think of what is called the Überweg, this enterprise, which is directed by Ulrich Rudolph in Zurich, and Peter Adamson is involved particularly with the English translation thereof. So it's a German enterprise, or German-speaking enterprise, but it's translated into English. And what is really great about this new attempt at writing a history of philosophy in the Islamic world, as they call it, is that they really want to cover everything from the first appearance of philosophy written in Arabic, and then it's flourishing, also the other languages appearing on the scene, like Persian, which becomes extremely important, but then of course also Ottoman Turkish and what have you. So they cover the Islamic world, as the title says, and they want to cover all the centuries ever since its emergence. And just recently, last fall or something, the fourth volume is which split into various tomes, but and so it's a thick thing, on the 19th and 20th century has appeared. There's still a huge gap they are working on currently, 13th through 18th centuries, which is of course the biggest chunk that exists. So that will still take a few more years. But I think that's really the kind of pioneering work that's currently going on. And it is a reflection of this insight also in Western scholarship, that by no means there was an interruption or a death or whatever of philosophy after the 12th century, after Averroes, but to the contrary, that a lot was going on, and there's really a huge bunch of things to be explored. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for the great explanation. Actually, I have also another question regarding the situation with the Persian-speaking academia and the global or international academia. So, as you might have noticed, there is very little connection between these two islands of scholarship, and so due to various reasons, including the disappointment that I just mentioned, there is very little interaction between these two groups of scholars, whereas the older generation of both Persian-speaking scholars and non-Iranian or non-Persian-speaking scholars such as Daneshpajou, Fanes, Landau, Muhaqqaq, and Gutas were very well aware of the scholarship of their colleagues. The younger generations on both sides has stopped caring for other parties' works. This has led to a very strange, I would say, strange situation where people start writing things which have been done before, or publishing things that someone on the other party has published, and this is not so good for domain of scholarship, which is not so big. It's not the scholarly academia of mathematics. It's just on falsafa, and the number of people is of course fewer than the mathematicians. You have the experience of working with Persian-speaking colleagues. I would like to know your opinion about the kind of contribution that they can have for the international academia of falsafa, and the things that the Iranian academia needs to learn from the international one, especially especially on the field of philosophy itself, not on the fields which are kind of related to the philosophy or falsafa, but they are not considered officially as philosophical, like except from philological contributions. I would be happy if you could give us a clue or a glimpse into this situation.
So let me first start with what I would consider a contribution Iranian scholars could have on or could give, and particularly which kind of contribution in addition to or contrast to or to what we do in European scholarship. So I think there is, and I'm leaving aside editions and these kinds of things, because obviously access to manuscripts is much easier if the library is around. But what my experience is that scholars that have grown up in Iran or under comparable circumstances also in other, for instance, Arabic-speaking countries, but let's focus on Iran. People who have grown up there and have had this kind of education also in the historical periods of their time. So, and I'm not only referring to falsafa now, but to this kind of broader background that I was referring to earlier. So when I know about also the adab of their own culture and kalam and perhaps other fields like linguistics, what have you. So if they have a sort of broader kind of cultural background, then usually my experience is that they can teach us about the thinking of also historical periods much more than we people trained in the West ever can attain. So my experience is that they have insights into, first, it's also a matter of the amount of texts that they have already swallowed, so to speak, and that they feel at home with. a Western scholar trained in the West, it's always, you have first to get into this, and then you have to find out about the context, and it really takes an awful lot of time to become familiar, really feel at home, and have the idea, okay, now this text I can really read and understand in a hermeneutically reflected and reliable manner. Whereas this is an advantage people trained in Iran really bring with them, or usually bring with them, that they have this kind of much broader insight and hence a much more subtle understanding, or much easier understanding of also historical texts than for people raised and trained in just Western academia. And so this is something I think is really very important. And then also, of course, there are cultural differences in the way people are brought up here in the German-speaking sphere or in Iran, and probably also depending on the region itself, there may be differences. And so I have the impression, I earlier mentioned this kind of philosophical conversation you can get into also with historical texts, so not just with contemporaries. But here I think the same is true with colleagues coming from the other tradition. The kind of conversation, philosophical conversation you can have about the concepts and the ways a colleague from Iran looks at the same texts and we discuss about the same ideas, the way they look at them can be really different from the way I look at them. And they're not stupid, so there is a good reason to take into account what's their approach and what's their view of it, and what do they take from this text, and what kind of sense does it make for them. And so in this kind of conversation, all of a sudden your own perspective is incredibly enlarged and enriched, I think. And so this is really something I would hope for in the future, and why I think it would be really important on all levels, already the student level, but then also us, the ones who are established scholars, but really to get into this kind of conversation about ideas, texts, issues we're interested in, but coming from our backgrounds. But of course, I mean, there is a lot of politics involved in this. I mean, everyone is in a way limited by the possibilities their own environment offers them. And you know yourself, I mean, you've lived in I don't know, the German-speaking world, perhaps you also were in the Anglophone world, but you'll have experienced that in scholarship, there's still this kind of, in Western scholarship, there's still this kind of arrogance that why should we take anything into account which is not produced by us? So of course there are openings, but I'd say there's still ignorance about the fact that we are just limiting ourselves in the West to usually Western perspectives and ignoring other perspectives and ignoring the potential that I just tried to describe. Other perspectives in a serious dialogue could bring into insight and philosophical views. So that's hopefully some helpful ideas.
Yeah, thank you. It was very helpful. Actually, that brings me to another thing, or the very last topic that I wanted to discuss with you. So in many of, in Iran, but also in several other Arabic or Persian or Turkish countries, the traditions of Falsafa and Kalam consider themselves as inheritors of, or the heirs of, to a tradition which we most of the time study as a historical phenomena. So one problem they have is that, I mean, maybe it's not a problem, but they are aware that they have, they are still actively using that heritage and are not encountering it as a purely historical phenomenon. So, but it seems to me, I mean, maybe it's not even a contrast, but it seems to be that the research, the method of research or modern scholarship on Falsafa or Arabic philosophy is highly influenced by the methodology of research on Latin philosophy. I mean, given your background in Latin philosophy, and also in light of our previous discussion, I would like to ask you to tell us to which extent the research on Falsafa or Arabic philosophy has been influenced by the research on Latin philosophy. Could we say that the modus operandi of the scholars of these two fields are similar? Do you observe the same tendency towards Hellenizing Falsafa in the scholarship on the Latin philosophy too? Or do you think the like at least the psychological approach of the scholars of that field is different?
Yeah, well, this is a very dense question, because I mean, because of the many issues that are involved to answer it accurately. So first of all, let me mention as some sort of prelude. If you look into the historiography of Western philosophy, then for the paradigm that's still prevailing to some extent is the one forged in the 19th century, the Hegelian pattern, and which is why the focus is so much just Eurocentric, and on the other hand, why certain periods of time, and among these specifically the Middle Ages, were more or less ignored. So the research on medieval Latin philosophy, like 50 or 100 years ago, was in a situation comparable to the research of Falsafa on Falsafa, like 20 or 50 years ago. So in a way, the research on Falsafa is lagging behind a little bit, but it's perceived within this historiographical view, it's perceived as belonging to the same kind of sphere, namely, excuse me, the medieval, and this is to say, let me have a sip of water, to some sort of rather theology than philosophy. And so it could be neglected. So this being said, so the medievalists have struggled a lot to show, well, look, this is serious philosophy. And so we should take it into account. And when we write the histories of philosophy, then we should also cover this period. And I think one of the major decisions, or perhaps it was even implicit, but was to show how closely it was related to ancient Greek thought. And to what extent it already foreshadowed what later on in modern philosophy, Descartes and what have you, what then would crop up and would be considered to be the kind of characteristics of modern Western and enlightened thought. So this is a little bit the strategy that was pursued. And of course, there were also other actors, some closely related to the Catholic Church, who wanted to show that this is important. And so, but I think the main current was to show how philosophical it is and how much you can distinguish it from whatever is found in theology and related to religion. So this kind of idea of enlightenment, you have to keep both really clearly distinguished. And my sense is that at least Western scholarship is very much on Falsafa, is very much influenced by this pattern. On the one hand, we feel like we have to show that Falsafa is worthy of being studied as a field of philosophy, as a historical and also contemporary, but a field of philosophy. So everyone should take it into account when they're interested in philosophy. And the strategy we choose to do so is to show, well, look, it's really Greek, and it's completely without religion, and it's really just pure analytic Falsafa or philosophy. And this is a little bit, I think, what is observable in much of the research that is produced in the West. I'm not so sure. What I know from Iranian scholarship, I don't have the impression that here that this kind of drive is really comparable. So I have the impression it's really due to different histories, so to speak, that also the approaches and what people look into and how willing they are to look into also fields that belong to tasawwur or to adab or to kalam, or to what extent they rather block that and just focus on what I describe as Falsafa in the narrow sense of the word. So I think that's very much a parallel. It's a slightly a temporal gap between both developments, the medieval Latin and research on Falsafa, but I have the impression that the patterns are repeating in a way.
So, but do you also see, I mean, so some, actually I'm representing now here some of my compatriots' views. So they say when we read the scholarship of neo-Thomists on Thomas Aquinas, we don't see such a heavy tendency towards Hellenizing Thomas. So they don't try much to show that there is a connection between Thomas and Aristotle, but they are rather ready to accept Thomas's independence of thought. Whereas when the other Europeans or other modern scholars come to Avicenna, they are not ready to appreciate Avicenna's independence, for example, or Farabi's independence of thought, at least in some areas. Of course, Avicenna and Farabi themselves considered themselves as belonging to the tradition of Falsafa, and they always venerated Aristotle as the greatest philosopher of the peripatetic tradition, but it doesn't mean that whatever they say is copied from Aristotle, or that they are mere interpreters, commentators, or they weren't able to produce their own thought or philosophy independently. Even though between the parentheses, I don't think that if someone is a commentator, he doesn't have an independent thought. But some people might distinguish between philosophers or divide philosophers into commentators and philosophers. I don't agree with this division, but at least some people think that it's correct.
Yeah, no, I mean that's right, and you're pointing at the Thomists, which is certainly a specific development, which is related to what I briefly referred to when I said there are also other movements like the ones that are more that have a more kind of religious background. So and Thomism is something, particularly the neo-Thomism you're referring to is a phenomenon that emerged in the 20th century, and was very much supported or developed by people who came from a Catholic Christian background. And so this has established itself as a track of thought, like you have neo-Aristotelianism and all sorts of neos in Western historiography nowadays. Or it's not historiography, it's more kind of research, not research, philosophy, dealing with texts by, in this case, Thomas Aquinas, but just dealing with it as though that Thomas was a contemporary philosopher. And so you bring out specific ideas, ethical ideas, for instance, that you find very important, and that you feel like, well, this is exactly what Thomas Aquinas says. And so he, in a way, he's read almost ahistorical. And as you rightly said, it's not really important to show, well, look, he's perfectly in line with Aristotle. So this is a development which is very specific and which is very much, I think, linked to the religious background, and which is why it's probably mostly present or observable in the field of philosophy of religion. Whereas in the camp of the historians of philosophy, this approach is not very widespread. It's because it's considered to be ahistorical and not accurate in terms of hermeneutics and so on. And so I have the impression these kinds of movements, at least in Western scholarship, with regard to Falsafa, do not exist. You only have the camp of the historians, if you look into the historical periods, and they do it as accurately according to historical hermeneutical standards as possible. But as I said, very much influenced by this and even often implicit. I think many of the scholars are not even aware of the fact that they are put on a specific track because of the history of their own field. And so it's still this idea of, I have to defend and to show how philosophical the topics or the thinkers are I'm interested in. And so the way I do it is like I said before, by showing how Aristotelian these scholars are. And you're right. So I think it's really a pity that great thinkers like Avicenna, the example you gave, that instead of looking into, so what are the things that he develops and the ideas he comes up with, and I think his thought is extremely rich in so many different fields. Instead of focusing on this and then taking the Aristotelian background for granted, no one would deny that, but looking into what he really does, his own ideas, synthesis and what have you. So I think we lose a lot by not sufficiently focusing and trying to bring out these aspects. So that's something I would really hope European scholarship would learn. And I think that's also perhaps a thing they could learn from Iranian scholarship. Just to add to the other question.
Thanks. So you would say that if those Iranian scholars who are complaining about this difference in approach look into the works properly belonging to the genre of history of philosophy, they would see the same tendency towards historicizing the concepts with regard to the medieval Latin philosophers that they see in the scholarship of the fields related to Falsafa, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, perhaps nowadays it's not as outspoken anymore in medieval Latin philosophy. And that's why I said, I mean, research on this field or in this field started like 50 years earlier than on Falsafa. So they are in their methods and in their approach, they're a little bit ahead. So among those people, so it's a small crowd of people doing medieval philosophy, but medieval Latin philosophy, that is. But still, it's much better established than those even fewer people interested in Falsafa. And so they don't. So in a way, it's shown that this is all in the vein of Aristotle. Now they can focus much more closely on the details, and even though it's not perhaps like the Thomists do, but still it's a doxographical kind of reconstruction and analysis and putting into connection of the various thinkers and schools that existed. So perhaps it's a little bit ahead of the kind of research we are doing on Falsafa, and could serve as a model to some extent, even though I think there are other aspects which we shouldn't follow because it would also be repeating the same historiographical mistakes, but that's another story.
Thank you very much. I've taken a lot of time from you. I have one last question, which is very short, and this concerns your current area of research, logic and philosophy of language. Which publication or which authors of scholarship in this area do you consider as the turning point? Like which author or which book has changed our view of the history of logic and philosophy of language in the Arabic tradition drastically in the last decades? I mean, something, of course, from your last edited book, one might, the students can gain a feeling of the state of the art. But do you have also other suggestions for the students who are interested in these fields, so that they can look into that and gain deeper knowledge of the current state of scholarship in this field?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I think here I should distinguish between the field of logic and the field of philosophy of language. Actually, in terms of logic, I think the initial turn, so to speak, in the field was perhaps initiated by Nicolas Rescher, which is of course very dated in the meantime. And then certainly by scholars like Tony Street and Wilfrid Hodges. People like them, I would say they really set the standard of the field, how it's looked like nowadays, and how it can be studied from really seriously. The field of philosophy of language, I think, it's much more underdeveloped, and this is perhaps also why, when I came across it, I decided to stick to it, because here I feel like there's really an awful lot to be done, and it sounds negative, but of course, on the other hand, it's also exciting, particularly in view of what we discussed earlier. I mean, if you look at what is extant in terms of texts, but you have to be open and really look across the disciplines. You cannot focus on Falsafa, because there you would just repeat Greek-inspired stuff. But you must look across the disciplines, and then if you look into these texts, you will find this kind of sophistication, which really reminds you of contemporary philosophy of language in, I don't know, international level, on the international level. And so I think this is really a field to explore, and it would be great if many people got interested into it, and then looked also in different eras, periods. So I mean, it's something which has developed over centuries. I mean, basically from the emergence of Islam and the first books dedicated to the theory of language. Just think of Sibawayh, the first book on, we call it grammar, but basically it's on language and linguistics and in general. So from this very initial point of development to the modern era, to the contemporary era. So that's something I really think like there we still lack some sort of masterwork or whatever. And perhaps the last book that I would like to mention, it's more general than just logic, but given that my focus is more on the philosophy of logic or epistemology, perhaps the book by Rosenthal on knowledge triumphant, which is focusing on the concept of ilm. And I think this is also a very far-sighted kind of approach to this core concept of ilm in the Islamic tradition. And I think it's a quarry where one really should get into all the material he taps into, but of course, due to time and place restrictions, couldn't really elaborate. So that's perhaps a little bit the things that come to my mind.
Thank you very much, Nadia. Thank you for your time, and thank you again for accepting my invitation.
No, thanks a lot to you. That was a very interesting interview, and very much hope that your project continues well and everything.
Thank you. See you later.